Hi, I'm making this screencast because the technology messed up earlier today, so we were only given a small amount of our presentation time, and I won't be able to present Friday morning. So anybody who comes can check out my presentation this way. But I'm sorry we won't have a chance to talk more because that's kind of what I wanted to do at the end. But anyway, um, I'm talking about the need to get rid of screen time. Of course, I'm not talking about actually eliminating time we spend in front of screens, but rather the term screen time. People have been talking about and concerned about screen time as long as there have been screens. Just some examples. Eleanor Maccabee, one of the best-known child development experts back in the 50s even, wrote a really decent paper on television and its impact on school children. In 52, the Journal of Education quoted A.S. Mosler, who was head of a major early childhood organization at that time, that TV seen robbing children of play. 53, Eddie wrote a thing in Exceptional Children about eye health and television and how television was so horrible for eye health. And then 10 years later in 63, relationship of TV viewing habits and aggressive behavior in children. There's a whole lot of them. The minute that TV became ubiquitous, people began worrying about it. But interestingly, they talked about it very often, not just as television, but as screen time. And that's where the term comes from. And in fact, a lot of the things you see published now or written about now for parents and educators about screen time is based on the old research done when screens were basically televisions. But of course, that's not true anymore. And here are the recommendations, by the way, the newest recommendations on the amount of, quote, screen time that people should have. From 0 to 18 months, the American Pediatric Association, the APA there, recommends no screen time at all, except possibly to video chat with distant relatives, briefly. 18 to 24 months, again, very little, if any, and you must co-view. 2 to 5 years, less than an hour daily, and again, the American Pediatric Association says you should be watching with your child. They should never be watching alone. Well, let's get a little older. The American Heart Association recommends for adolescents and children, 6 to 17, less than 2 hours of screen time daily. And adult recommendations are a little harder to pin down, but the National Institutes of Health recommends less than 2 hours outside of work requirements. And Maldev et al., which did a big study, commissioned big study, recommends less than or equal to 6 hours total on screen. Okay, those are the recommendations. Now let's look at what we know about how much screen time people actually spend. The realities, and these are all, by the way, pre-COVID. Whitney and Peterson did a large survey published in 2019. Children from 0 to 2 watch an average of 3 hours a day on screens, spend an average of 3 hours a day on screens. And 3 to 5 spend 2.75 hours a day on screens. So compare that with the recommendations here. Sorry, this seems to have gone crazy. I don't know why. Just a minute, we'll get back to it. Okay, compare that with the recommendations here. No screen time, up to 2, and in fact 3 hours a day. Children 8 to 12, Common Sense Media did, again, a large survey, spend 4.4 hours a day on screens outside of school or homework use. And children from 13 to 18 spend over 7 hours a day outside of school or homework use on screens. I don't know when they sleep. Perhaps they don't. Adults' Vision Direct survey shows 17 hours a day. This is all pre-pandemic. Everything we've got shows that these amounts have gone up since then. All right, so when you contrast the recommendations and what's really happening, there's a world of difference. But the problem is we're looking at screen time, and all types of screens have been conflated in that. So what's wrong with putting two kids playing a video game together, somebody working on their computer, somebody playing Pokemon Go, walking around outside, a guy doing an exercise video, a grandfather Zooming with or doing FaceTime with his family. We have down at the very bottom here the typical gamer, alone in a darkened room playing by himself, and then somebody texting. What's wrong with lumping those all together as screen time? Well, first of all, we feel guilty, worried, and defeated about our own and our kids' screen time all the time. Somebody who was in the earlier presentation said, wow, when I'm going to think about this whole thing differently, because every time I walk into my pediatrician's office, there's this big poster about limiting screen time, and I kind of just turn away knowing that I can't do it. And the fact is, given the difference between the recommendations and what we know is happening, we can't do it. Okay? Screens are too important to us. They serve too many purposes. But still, because of that lumping all those screens together, we get these scare headlines about the average U.S. adult will spend equivalent to 44 years of their life, which is like more than half, staring at screens. I don't think that's probably true unless I don't know what they're counting. But, New York Times, does your family need to cut down on screen time? CBS News, health experts say parents need to drastically cut kids' screen time. Again, New York Times, children's screen time has soared in the pandemic, alarming parents and researchers. Okay, so by using this big lump term, screen time, it's we're basically setting ourselves up for defeat. Okay, another big problem is that we're failing to differentiate screen time, one type from another, has made it more difficult in many cases to do technology-enhanced instructions in schools, but it also messes with the effectiveness. Because if we just consider everything screen time and not the quality or what's going on during that screen time, we end up with, for example, the disaster of personalized instruction from a couple of years ago, where kids were being plunked on computers by themselves, doing very, I don't know the right way to say it, but very simplistic programs for 6 hours a day. And of course, Waters wrote about that and says, that's not what personalization means, but that's how it was interpreted by many schools, because they're saying, okay, we just put them in front of this computer that supposedly adapts to everything they need, and they answer questions, right? And then, of course, when the coronavirus came along, we all panicked about how much screen time kids were going to spend doing online school, when really what we should have been panicking about was the quality of that online schooling, because teachers had no education, no understanding of how to do online school, and they were thrown into it in 2 weeks. So it wasn't because kids were in front of screens. It was because teachers didn't know what to do with kids in front of screens that we had so much difficulty. Another big problem in our own field is that conflating all screen time together leads to bad research. Questions are underspecified, and so the results are not very useful. And here are just 3 examples of fairly recent research that has conflated screen time and thus is going to result in... Anyway, let's take a look. Okay, Twenge and Campbell. The current research aims to examine associations between screen time, and they specifically, this is from their quote, including cell phones, computers, electronic devices, electronic games, and TV, and a diverse array of measures of psychological well-being. Well, if you're going to correlate measures of psychological well-being with screen time in general, obviously the psychological effect of doing social media on your cell phone is going to be kind of different from the psychological effect of watching TV and the psychological effect of playing computer games. Those are all going to be very different. We know social media has a very strong impact, especially on young girls. We have no indication that watching TV has that kind of impact. It has very different impacts. So when you're trying to do research looking at the associations between screen time and doing all these different things, you're going to end up with noise. You're not going to end up with results that mean anything. Another example, Duke et al. In 2013. This paper summarizes the literature examining correlates of screen media use in children 36 months of age and younger, with an emphasis on parental and home-based characteristics. Well, I have a 1-year-old granddaughter, and since she was about 4 months old, she's been doing screen time, talking to her grandparents and her great-grandparents who she can't see because she was born during the coronavirus. None of them can travel. And she, of course, at 1 cannot get immunized either. So, she does video conferencing via Zoom with them. And that kind of screen time has a very different effect from the parent who plunks their kid in front of a couple of hours of cartoons a day. Okay? But they're looking at correlates of all of those things. And it's going to be quite different. In fact, if you wonder about the value of Zoom chatting, video chatting for very young children, it's been very interesting to me watching how my young granddaughter actually recognizes people. She knows that those are people out there. And the reason I say that is because her paternal grandfather was able actually to travel and quarantine long enough to come see her just a couple weeks ago. And when he came in the door, she knew who he was just from the video chats. So I think a lot more is going on there than we think. Another example, Dominguez Montanari, 2017. This review summarizes the most recent evidence on the effects of screen time on the physiological and psychological developments of children. Well, that's a pretty big claim. But when you looked into what she actually reviewed, almost all the studies were about television. So obviously that kind of screen time is going to have a very different physiological effect than, say, playing tennis Wii on your Nintendo or doing Pokemon Go, walking all over the neighborhood. But people make claims with these large conflated things, and we end up with research that really isn't very useful to us. Okay, worst of all, a focus on screen time keeps us focused on quantity. Everybody's looking at how much, rather than the quality, the context, the individual differences among people, and the risk versus benefit. For example, again, a lot of this, I have very personal illustrations because my life is the only life I've lived. So my mother was in a nursing home for over 20 years in Florida, and screen time was a lifesaver for her because that was pretty much the only way she could see and talk to most of her grandchildren who couldn't afford to travel from Chicago and Pennsylvania and other places to visit her. Okay, so the risk versus benefit for her of that kind of screen time was huge. Consider, again, people who are bedridden. My mother could watch sports. She could travel on the Travel Channel and all that when she couldn't move out of her bed. Screen time, even when it's just television, for her was a very different thing than screen time for an 8-year-old who ought to be outside playing some of the time, So when we start just focusing on screen time, we don't focus on the things we need to focus on. And I want to offer an analogy here. When we talk about screen time, it would be like talking about paper time. It's not about the time you spend looking at paper. It's about what you're reading, why you're reading it, who wrote it, why they wrote it, and what else you could be doing at the time. So if you're reading trashy romance novels, which I guess a lot of folks have, I happen to read trashy mystery novels, but we all read trash once in a while. But if you spend hours a day doing that and you're neglecting your work, or you're neglecting your schoolwork, or you're never getting outside, well, that's a bad use of paper time. That's bad paper time, right? But nobody sits around and quantifies how much paper time you're spending, because if you're doing homework, or you're looking at you're reading your insurance policy, or you're reading a really worthwhile book, or you're using just something light to settle down before you go to sleep, those are all different kinds of paper time. Nobody talks about that. In fact, we encourage reading, and I do too. That's one of my fields of research, so I'm not trying to diss reading. But what I'm trying to say is when we look at screen time, we have to think about it in the same way, that there's all different kinds. And Rob, who is the director for Common Sense Media, the research director for Common Sense Media, has an article that he has a really nice quote that I wanted to share. And he's saying that key to the nuance of understanding screen media use is understanding that all screens are not equal. We shouldn't act as though 1 hour of old DuckTales cartoons is the same as 1 hour of Zooming with a family member, or 1 hour of playing Fortnite with a friend, or 1 hour of drawing tutorials on YouTube. What a person gets out of each is totally different, and it satisfies different needs. So, what am I proposing instead? I am proposing that instead of doing any more research or sending out any more generic warnings on screen time, that as researchers in the field of electronic communications and technology, we need to start to differentiate screen time. And I've got 6 different continua on which we could be looking at the quality and effects of screen time. And honestly, these continua might also be useful just to look at the quality and effects of technology in general. But the first continuum is this screen time relationship building, or is it isolating? For example, my son, when he was 14, was head of a 2,000-person clan in Legacy, which was an early MMORPG. 2,000 people that included people from Japan, from India, from South America, included soldiers stationed in Iraq. He was the head of that whole clan at the age of 14. He got to know all these people and had an incredible leadership role and built relationships with some of them that still last now, 20 years later. Okay, that kind of screen time for him was relationship building. So is the FaceTiming with your grandkids. Versus isolating screen time, where you shut yourself away when you're texting on your phone during a family dinner. That makes a difference. Is the screen time physically active or sedentary? One of the big objections that most the American Pediatric Association and the American Heart Association have against screen time is that most of the time when we're using screens, we're sitting down and not doing anything else. But that doesn't mean we have to do that. Maybe we can design more screens that are physically active, like Nintendo Wii tennis games and Pokemon Go walking around the neighborhood and using exercise videos. Again, those are not harmful to the heart kinds of screen time. So we need to differentiate these things. The one that, as a former K-12 teacher, I'm particularly interested in is the screen time cognitively active or cognitively passive? And this, by the way, is the big problem with television. We have some research showing that most people, when they're watching television by themselves, go into alpha brainwaves, which are the same brainwaves you have when you're hypnotized, when you're daydreaming, when you're driving long distances. You know how you drive a long distance, you kind of look up and go, oh, I didn't know I was here yet. Yeah, those alpha brainwaves don't do anything for brain development. Okay, they don't help us learn anything. And that's what most people are doing when they're watching TV by themselves. So screen time that's cognitively passive is much more harmful, and especially to children's initial cognitive development, than screen time that's cognitively active. And we can make that differentiation. And that's a differentiation which, by the way, we ought to apply to the screen programs that are being sold for use with our kids in school. Many of these prepackaged programs in reading and math are very cognitively passive. You watch it, you watch the dancing gorillas, and then you click on the correct letter. Okay, that's not much. We should demand that programs and technology used in schools is cognitively active, that it makes you think, because that's what's good for kids. Okay, another continuum that I think is vital, especially in today's media use, is empowering versus exploitive. If I'm watching a YouTube video that teaches me, as I did recently, how to change the battery in my Toyota key so I don't have to pay $138 to the Toyota dealer to change the battery in my key, that's an empowering use of screen time. That's good. That's useful. That's positive. If I'm watching a video that is trying to sell me something, or is trying to tell me that trying to say, well, you need this body type, or, something like that, that's an exploitive video, exploitive screen time, which I think could also, another thing that would go in that category to me are some of the cartoons that show on TV whose major purpose is to sell toys to kids. The cartoons themselves, the plots are pretty bad. The characterization doesn't even exist. The whole reason that the cartoons exist is so kids will go out and buy the associated toys. That's exploitive screen time. This next one is a little hard to define. I've been looking for the terms, but some screen time is life supporting. It supports you in your real life. If I'm looking online for recipes for a new dish I want to try to cook for my family, that supports an aspect of my life that's important, cooking for my family, okay? Versus life usurping. Again, I'm going to use the kid who is texting during the family dinner. In other words, the screen time is substituting for usurping a place where real life really should be there, rather than supporting real life. And then the last continuum I want to talk about, and this is, of course, very appropriate in our current political environment, is educative screen time and miseducative screen time. Educative screen time, helps you know more about the world, sort of the definition of education, whereas miseducative screen time is false stuff that's trying to give you a false picture of the world. And political stuff is very, very easy to think of in this way. But think about some other things. Think about TV shows that seem to show that everybody, even poor people, have large apartments and are rich and drive new cars. Think about all video games that imply that the way that you make it in life is by hitting the big time. That it's not, video games are not big on people who just work day after day after day. So in some cases, those could be considered miseducative. So anyway, that's what I'm proposing. This is 22 minutes in. I was hoping that we'd have at least 2/3 of the time to just talk about these things. But I just wanted to bring this idea up and say, as a community of researchers and scholars and teachers using educational technology, which almost always has screens involved, we need to stop talking about screen time, and we need to help other people stop talking about screen time and start looking in a much more detailed fashion, a much more nuanced fashion at what is happening with that screen time and how it's working, which will not only help us avoid the stigma of, well, yeah, you're the tech people, you just want people on screens all the time, but I think will also help us think about the quality of the screen time that we're asking for and how it might impact different people differently and things like that. All these really interesting questions that we can get into once we stop talking about, well, how much screen time should people have? So anyway, thanks very much for listening. I wish I could have been there with you all. Bye.